to Story 1, the Hinterkaifeck Mystery. In the spring of 1922, on a remote farmstead in the heart of the Bavarian forest, a 63-year-old man named Andreas Gruber found something in the snow that should have sent him running for his life. He was standing on the edge of his property when he spotted a set of human footprints. They began at the tree line and led directly toward his home. But as he followed them, his blood went cold. There were no return tracks. The footprints went into his farm, but they never came back out. Anyone else would have grabbed their family and fled, but Andreas just walked back inside and went to bed. The mystery isn't just that his entire family would be found slaughtered a few days later. The mystery is why the person who made those tracks stayed in the house for nearly a week after the murders, cooking meals in their kitchen and feeding their cattle, while the bodies of the Gruber family lay rotting in the barn just a few yards away. It is one of the most chilling puzzles in history. Tonight, I am going to tell you 10 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please invite the like button over to your farmhouse for a warm bowl of soup, but then the second it sits down to eat, I want you to grab a heavy pickaxe and chase it back into the dark woods as fast as you can. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our first story. The wind does not just blow through the trees in the Bavarian countryside during the late winter months. It moans. It is a low, guttural sound that vibrates through the thick pine needles and rattles the heavy timber frames of the old farmhouses. On the night of March 31st, 1922, the air around the farm, known as Hinterkaifeck, was thick with a damp, bone-chilling mist. The only sound was the rhythmic creaking of a rusty weather vane on top of the barn, swinging back and forth in the darkness. There was a heaviness to the silence in that valley, a kind of pressure that made your ears pop and your skin crawl, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Andreas Gruber was not a man who was easily scared. He was a hard, abrasive, and deeply unpopular man who had spent his entire life carving a living out of the stubborn German soil. He lived at Hinterkaifeck with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and his 2 grandchildren, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They were a family that kept to themselves, partly by choice and partly because the nearby villagers of Kaifeck wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. The farm was located about an hour north of Munich, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. It was a place where time seemed to move slower. Andreas spent his days following a rigid, grueling routine that had not changed in decades. He would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, long before the sun even thought about rising. He would pull on his heavy wool trousers and his worn leather boots, the ones with the thick soles that left deep imprints in the mud. Every single morning, he would walk across the damp courtyard to the barn. He would grab a heavy wooden bucket and begin the process of milking the cows. He would sit on a small stool, his forehead pressed against the warm flank of the animal, listening to the rhythmic ping of milk hitting the bottom of the pail. It was a chore he had done thousands of times, a mindless task that allowed him to get lost in his own thoughts. He never looked around. He never checked the shadows. After the milking was done, he would carry the heavy buckets back to the main house. He would enter through the heavy oak door, the one that always stuck a little bit at the bottom, and set the milk on the kitchen table. His wife, Cecilia, would be there, already stoking the fire in the large iron stove. She would move with a slow, deliberate pace, her joints aching from the cold. She would prepare a simple breakfast of thick bread and salted butter while the rest of the house slept. Then came the feeding of the pigs. Andreas would head back out, hauling bags of grain across his shoulders. He would walk the perimeter of the fences, checking for any signs of damage from the winter storms. He would hammer down loose boards and tighten the wire. He was a man of order and control. He believed that if he followed the rules of the land would provide. He did not believe in ghosts, and he certainly did not believe in the strange rumors the villagers whispered. But in the days leading up to that final night in March, the order of Andreas's world began to fracture in small, inexplicable ways. It started with the footprints. He had found them in the fresh snow, leading from the woods straight to the back of the barn. He spent hours searching the property, looking for a stranger hiding in the hayloft or crouched behind the sheds, but he found no one. He told a few neighbors about it, but he refused to borrow a gun or ask for help. Then, things inside the house began to shift. Andreas found a newspaper on the porch one morning that he had never subscribed to. It was a local paper from a town miles away. None of his family members had bought it. A few hours later, he realized the heavy brass keys to the house had vanished from the hook by the door. He searched every pocket and every drawer, but they were gone. He assumed he had simply misplaced them, but a cold knot of anxiety was starting to form in his stomach. That night, as the family sat around the table for dinner, Andreas heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a dull thud coming from directly above them, in the attic. It sounded like a heavy boot hitting the floorboards. He looked at his wife and his daughter, but they just continued eating, their faces tired and drawn. He didn't say a word. He didn't want to admit that something was wrong. He just stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence that followed, wondering who was up there. Now, I want you to step into the shoes of Maria Baumgartner. Maria was the new maid, and she had only arrived at the farm on the afternoon of March 31st. She was young, nervous, and looking for a fresh start. The previous maid had quit months ago, claiming the house was haunted, and Maria had heard the stories. As she walked up the long, muddy path to the front door, she felt a wave of nausea hit her. The air around the farm felt stagnant, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. When Maria entered the kitchen, the smell of old wood and cold grease filled her nose. She met Andreas, who barely looked at her as he pointed toward her small room. As the sun began to set, Maria felt a primal urge to leave, but she needed the work. She spent the evening unpacking her small suitcase, her hands shaking as she folded her clothes. Every time a floorboard creaked in the hallway, she stopped breathing. She felt like there were eyes on her, watching her from the dark corners. As night fell, Maria heard Victoria calling for everyone to come out to the barn. There was a problem with one of the animals. Maria stayed in her room, huddled under the thin blankets. She heard the heavy footsteps of the family leaving the house, one by one. She heard the front door click shut. Then, there was nothing but the sound of her own heart thumping in her chest. She lay there, staring at the door, waiting for them to come back. But the house remained silent. Hours passed. You are sitting in your own home right now, perhaps with the lights dimmed. You think about your own locks, your own familiar sounds. Now, put yourself in that attic. You have been hiding there for days, watching this family through the cracks in the wood. You know their names, you know when they eat and when they sleep. You have their keys in your pocket. You see them walking toward the barn in the moonlight. Do you follow them? Or do you wait for them to come back? Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and the young granddaughter entered the barn. They were expecting to find a sick cow, but instead they found a nightmare waiting in the shadows. One by one, they were struck down with a heavy, sharp tool, likely a mattock or a pickaxe. The killer was precise and brutal. After the family was dead, the killer walked back into the house. He found Maria in her bed and Joseph in his crib. He didn't hesitate. He finished what he had started. But here is the part that will keep you awake tonight. The bodies were not discovered for several days. During that time, the neighbors noticed smoke coming from the chimney. They saw the cattle being let out into the fields and then brought back in. They saw lights moving behind the windows at night. The killer did not flee. He moved into the Gruber's house. He ate their food, he slept in their beds, and he took care of their farm. All while 6 corpses lay cold in the barn and the nursery. When the bodies were finally found by a group of concerned neighbors, the scene was so horrific that several of the men vomited on the spot. The investigation that followed was a disaster. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, but no one was ever charged. The skulls of the victims were even sent to clairvoyants in Munich in a desperate attempt to find the killer, but it was useless. The motive remained a mystery. It wasn't robbery, as a large amount of money was left untouched in the house. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was eventually demolished a year later. The villagers couldn't stand to look at it anymore. As the heavy beams were pulled down, workers found evidence of the killer's hiding spot in the attic, including the missing keys and the newspaper. Andreas had found. The case remains unsolved to this day, a dark stain on the history of the region. The Gruber family's life was defined by their isolation, and in the end, that isolation allowed a monster to move in among them. The silence that once hung over that Bavarian farm didn't just vanish when the house was destroyed. It seemed to travel, carried on the wind, to other places, other homes where people think they are safe behind locked doors. Because the truth is, you can lock your doors, and you can watch the perimeter. But sometimes, The threat is already inside, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. And as we leave the cold fields of Germany behind, we find ourselves heading east. We are traveling thousands of miles away to the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, Japan. It is the year 2000, a time of technology and progress, far removed from the primitive tools of 1922. But as we will see in our next story, the same kind of inexplicable, cold-blooded presence can manifest anywhere. Because just like the Gruber family, the Miyazawa family was about to find out that sometimes a killer doesn't just want to take your life. Sometimes they want to take your place. Story 2. The Setagaya Family Massacre. The blue light from the computer monitor flickered in the dark room, casting long, distorted shadows against the wall. There was no sound in the house except for the steady, rhythmic clicking of a mouse. Click, click, click. A hand, stained with something dark and sticky, moved the mouse with clinical precision, navigating through a website for a local theater troupe. In the kitchen downstairs, 4 empty containers of melon-flavored ice cream sat on the counter, the sticky residue slowly drying in the cold midnight air. Outside, the streets of Setagaya were silent, wrapped in the heavy chill of a Tokyo winter. But inside this particular house, the air felt different. It was heavy, metallic, and still. The man sitting at the computer did not seem to mind the silence or the smell. He was not in a hurry. He had been in the house for hours, and he intended to stay for many more. He was making himself at home in a place where everyone else had stopped breathing, enjoying the small comforts of a life that did not belong to him. Mikio Miyazawa was 44 years old and worked as a consultant for a British brand identity firm. He was a man who appreciated structure and clarity. He lived in a modern, 3-story house in the Setagaya district with his wife Yasuko, who was 41, their 8-year-old daughter Niina, and their 6-year-old son Rei. They were the kind of family that neighbors described as perfectly ordinary, the sort of people who always waved and kept their small front garden tidy and welcoming. Yasuko ran a small tutoring business from their home, helping local children with their studies. She was patient and kind, always keeping a bowl of sweets on the table for her students. Their home was a place of constant activity, filled with the sounds of children playing and the smell of home-cooked meals. They were happy, successful, and deeply connected to their community. They were exactly where they wanted to be as the year 2000 prepared to draw to a close and a new century began. The night of December 30th, 2000, was supposed to be a quiet transition into the new year. Mikio followed his end-of-year routine with the same care he gave to his consulting projects. He started by clearing his work desk, filing away papers, and shutting down his laptop for the holiday break. He took his time, making sure every pen was in its place and every folder was labeled correctly. He liked the feeling of a clean slate, a physical representation of leaving the old year behind. Downstairs, Yasuko was in the kitchen, preparing for the traditional New Year feast. She spent nearly an hour washing and chopping vegetables, the sound of the knife hitting the wooden cutting board creating a steady beat. She organized the ingredients into small glass bowls, covering each one with plastic wrap and placing them in the refrigerator. She checked the expiration dates on the milk and the juice, wiping down the counters until they sparkled under the fluorescent kitchen lights. The children were in their rooms, getting ready for bed. Nina spent a long time brushing her hair, counting each stroke just like her mother taught her. She picked out her favorite pajamas, the ones with the small floral patterns, and folded her school clothes neatly over the back of a chair. Meanwhile, little Ray was playing with his toy cars, lining them up in a perfect row across the tatami mats. He moved them one by one, making soft engine noises, completely lost in his own little world. After the children were tucked in, Mikio and Yasuko sat in the living room for a final cup of tea. They talked about their plans for the coming year, about the school Niina would be attending, and the growth of Yasuko's tutoring business. Mikio checked his personal email one last time, a habit he couldn't quite break. He scrolled through a few messages, deleted some spam, and then finally logged off at exactly 10:38 in the evening. It was the last time any member of the family would use the internet. The transition from peace to terror did not happen with a loud bang. It began with a sound so subtle that Mikio almost didn't hear it. It was the sound of a fence being climbed. Their house was bordered on one side by a large public park, and a small wooded area came right up to their property line. The park was usually empty at this hour, but Mikio heard the faint metallic rattle of the chain-link fence vibrating. It was a sound he had heard before when teenagers hung out in the park, but tonight, it felt heavy. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness of the trees. He saw nothing but the swaying branches of the pines. He went to the front door and checked the lock, then walked to the back of the house to do the same. Everything seemed fine. But when he returned to the living room, he noticed that the family dog was standing by the stairs, its ears pricked forward and a low growl vibrating in its throat. The dog wasn't looking at the door, it was looking up at the second-floor window. Mikio decided to check the upstairs one more time. He walked up the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. As he reached the second-floor landing, he felt a sudden draft of cold air. It was sharp and unexpected, as if a window had been left wide open to the winter night. He turned the corner toward the bathroom, and that is when he saw it. A dark shape was huddled near the small window that led to the park side of the house. The window was open, and the screen had been cut away cleanly. The shape moved, and Mikio realized it was a man. But the man wasn't trying to hide or run away. He was just standing there, holding a long, thin knife that caught the light from the hallway. Mikio didn't scream. His brain was trying to process the logic of the situation. Why was this person here? How did he get through the small window? He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his voice calm but trembling as he asked the stranger what he wanted from his family. Now, I want you to imagine you are Mikio in that moment. You are a protector, a father, a husband. Your wife and children are sleeping just a few feet away. You have no weapon. You have no training in combat. The man in front of you is wearing a colorful scarf and a waist pouch, looking more like a hiker than a killer. You have a split second to make a choice. Do you tackle him? Do you run for the phone? Or do you try to talk him down, hoping that he is just a desperate thief who can be reasoned with? Mikio chose to protect his family. He lunged at the intruder, trying to push him back toward the window. But the killer was younger, stronger, and prepared for the violence. The struggle was short and brutal. Mikio was overwhelmed almost instantly. The killer then moved through the house with a terrifying sense of purpose. He went to the rooms where the children were sleeping. He went to the kitchen where Yasuko was. By the time the sun began to rise over Tokyo, the Miyazawa family was gone. But the bizarre reveal is not just the crime itself. It is what happened after the struggle ended. The killer did not flee into the night. Instead, he stayed. He opened the refrigerator and took out several containers of melon-flavored ice cream, eating them one by one while sitting at the kitchen table. He used the family's first aid kit to carefully bandage a wound on his own hand. He then sat down at Mikio's computer and spent hours browsing the internet, looking at theater websites and university pages. He even used the family's toilet, leaving behind physical evidence that showed a complete lack of fear or urgency. He stayed in the house for nearly 10 hours after the murders. He took some of Mikio's clothes and left his own blood-stained garments neatly folded in the house. He even took a nap on the sofa. When he finally decided to leave, he walked out the front door and vanished into the cold morning air, leaving behind a crime scene that would haunt the Japanese police for the next quarter century. Despite leaving behind a staggering amount of evidence, including his ADN, his fingerprints, and the very clothes he wore, the killer was never found. The police discovered that the sand in his waist pouch came from a specific area in California, and his clothes were made in a way that suggested he might not even be from Japan. They tracked his movements through his internet history, seeing that he had stayed on the computer until nearly 5 in the morning, long after the rest of the neighborhood had woken up. Today, the Miyazawa house still stands, but it is encased in a protective structure, a silent monument to a mystery that has no answer. The police still keep a small station nearby, waiting for a lead that never comes. The case of the Setagaya family is a reminder that the world can be a place of inexplicable darkness, where the boundaries between the safe and the dangerous are much thinner than we like to believe. And as we leave the quiet streets of Tokyo, we move toward a different kind of darkness. We are traveling to the sun-drenched hills of Italy, to the city of Florence. It is a place of art, culture, and romance. But in the late 1960s, a shadow began to fall over the Tuscan countryside. While the killer in Tokyo was a ghost who stayed for one night, the next monster we will discuss was a phantom who haunted the hills for nearly 2 decades. He did not want to live the life of his victims. He wanted to take pieces of them with him, turning the beauty of Italy into a landscape of fear. Story 3. The Monster of Florence. The hills of Tuscany in the middle of summer are supposed to be the most romantic place on earth. The air is thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and ripening grapes, and the moon hangs so low over the cypress trees that you feel like you could reach out and touch it. It is the kind of place where young couples go to escape the crowded streets of Florence, driving their small cars into the shadows of the olive groves to find a moment of peace and a bit of privacy under the stars. But for 17 years, those same hills were a hunting ground. A phantom was moving through the tall grass, armed with a .22 caliber Beretta pistol and a sharp surgical knife. He did not want money, and he did not want to talk. He wanted to watch, and then he wanted to transform a night of love into a scene from a nightmare. The mystery is not just that he was never caught, but that he performed his crimes with the precision of a trained surgeon, leaving behind clues that suggested a dark, hidden world. Tonight, I am going to tell you the third story in our series of 10 about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. Now, let us get into our next case. The sound of the night in the Italian countryside is usually a symphony of cicadas, thousands of them vibrating in the heat, creating a wall of sound that blankets the hills. It is a constant, rhythmic buzzing that eventually becomes a part of the silence itself, a white noise that makes you forget the world exists. But on the night of September 14th, 1974, the cicadas in a small clearing near the town of Borgo San Lorenzo suddenly went quiet. The air became heavy and still, the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. There was no wind to rustle the leaves, and no light except for the pale glow of a car's dashboard. In that silence, the only thing you could hear was the metallic click of a safety being switched off, a sound so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Pasquale Gentilcore was 19 years old and full of the kind of energy that only comes with being young and in love in Italy. He was a hard worker, spent his days at a local factory, but his world revolved around his girlfriend, 18-year-old Stefania Pettini. Stefania was a bright, spirited girl with a smile that could light up the gloomiest street in Florence. She loved poetry and music, and she had a way of making every ordinary moment feel like an adventure. They were the kind of couple everyone rooted for. They had their whole lives ahead of them, talking about marriage and children while they sat in Pasquale's small Fiat 127. They were anchored in the normalcy of their community, a place where everyone knew your name and your family's history. To their neighbors, they were just two kids starting out, safe in the warm embrace of the Tuscan hills. They had no reason to believe that the darkness surrounding their car held anything other than the quiet peace of the countryside they had known since they were born. The drive out of the city that evening was slow and deliberate. Pasquale took his time, navigating the winding dirt roads that snaked through the vineyards. He knew these roads by heart, every dip and every sharp turn. He drove past old stone farmhouses where families were sitting down to dinner, the smell of wood smoke and garlic wafting through the open windows. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to savor the evening, enjoying the way the sunset turned the hills into a sea of gold and deep purple. Every few miles, he would glance over at Stefania, watching the way the wind tossed her hair. They reached their favorite spot, a secluded lane bordered by thick hedges and ancient oak trees, at around 9:30. Pasquale turned off the engine, but he left the radio playing softly. A popular Italian ballad was fading out, replaced by the low hum of the announcer's voice. He leaned back in his seat, the fabric of his jacket rustling against the vinyl. He took a deep breath, smelling the dry earth and the distant pines. They sat there for a long time, just talking. Pasquale described a new project at work, his hands moving as he spoke, emphasizing his points with the passion typical of a young Italian man. Stefania listened, her chin resting on her hand, occasionally reaching out to touch his arm. The routine of their conversation was a comfort, a familiar dance they had performed dozens of times before. They felt invisible to the rest of the world, tucked away in their small metallic sanctuary, protected by the dark. The moon climbed higher, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hood of the car. Pasquale reached for a pack of cigarettes on the dashboard, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet cabin. He struck a match, the small flame illuminating their faces for a brief second before he blew it out. He watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, drifting out of the slightly cracked window. Everything was as it should be. The world was predictable, peaceful, and entirely focused on the two of them in that small clearing. They had been there for nearly an hour when the subtle shift began. It wasn't a loud noise or a sudden movement. It was a change in the atmosphere. The car, which had felt like a fortress of privacy, suddenly felt exposed. The shadows of the oak trees seemed to stretch further than they had before, creeping toward the tires. Stefania stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. She didn't see a face, but she saw a flicker of movement, a slight distortion in the darkness behind them. Pasquale noticed her change in mood and asked what was wrong. He tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was probably just a fox or a stray dog moving through the brush. He reached out to adjust the mirror, but as he did, he felt a wave of cold air enter the car. The wind hadn't picked up, but the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. The music on the radio started to crackle with static, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the romantic mood. The cicadas remained deathly silent. Now, I want you to put yourself inside that Fiat. The windows are starting to fog up from the heat of your breath, blurring the world outside into a gray smudge. You are sitting in the driver's seat, and you feel a sudden, sharp pressure against the back of your head. Not a hand, but something cold and circular. The barrel of a gun. Your heart isn't just racing. It is vibrating in your throat. Your hands are frozen on the steering wheel, your knuckles white. You want to scream, but your lungs feel like they are filled with lead. You hear a voice, but it isn't a shout. It is a whisper, a low, calm sound that is more terrifying than any scream could ever be. You realize that this person didn't just stumble upon you. They have been following you. They know how long you have been here. They have been standing in the tall grass, less than 5 feet away, waiting for the perfect moment when you felt the most secure. You feel the metal of the gun twitch, and you know that in the next heartbeat, your entire world is going to vanish. You are faced with a choice that no 19-year-old should ever have to make. Do you try to throw the car into gear and floor the accelerator, hoping the gunman loses his balance? Or do you put your hands up and plead for the life of the girl sitting next to you, hoping there is a shred of humanity left in the shadow behind you? Because here is the thing, Pasquale didn't get to choose. The trigger was pulled before he could even draw a breath to speak. The nightmare had begun. The killer, known to history as the Monster of Florence, did not stop after the shots were fired. He dragged Stefania's body away from the car into the clearing. And that is where the bizarre reveal takes place. This was not a random act of rage. The killer used a knife to perform a precise, ritualistic mutilation on Stefania's body. He removed specific parts of her anatomy with the skill of someone who had spent years in an operating room. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a collector of trophies, a man with a dark obsession. The investigation into the Monster of Florence would span decades and involve over 100,000 interviews. The police would follow a trail that led from simple farmers to high-ranking members of Italian society. They found a Beretta pistol that had been used in a murder 6 years earlier, suggesting the killer had been active much longer than anyone realized. They even explored theories of a secret occult sect, a group of wealthy men who paid the killer to bring them the offerings he carved from his victims in the Tuscan hills. Several men were eventually arrested and convicted for some of the murders, including a local farmer named Pietro Pacciani and his 2 picnic friends. But many experts believe the true mastermind, the one who actually held the surgical knife and the Beretta, was never truly identified. The convictions were messy, filled with retracted testimonies and conflicting evidence. To this day, the families of the victims still wait for a final, clear answer that may never come, as the hills of Tuscany keep their secrets buried deep in the earth. The fear that the Monster of Florence instilled in the people of Italy didn't just go away when the killings stopped in 1985. It changed the way people looked at the landscape. The romantic groves and the quiet lanes became places of suspicion. People began to realize that even in the most beautiful settings, evil can be lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. The sense of security that we all feel in our private moments is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a shadow in the grass. As we leave the blood-stained hills of Italy, we cross the Atlantic Ocean to the American Midwest. We are going back in time, to the year 1912, to a small town called Villisca in Iowa. While the Monster of Florence hunted in the open air, our next story takes us inside the one place where every human being expects to be the safest. Because as the Moore family was about to find out, a house with locked doors and covered windows can still hold a horror that no one can explain. Story 4. The Villisca Axe Murders. In the early morning hours of June 10, 1912, a small town in Iowa was waking up to a beautiful summer day. The birds were chirping, the sun was warming the soil, and the smell of fresh coffee was beginning to drift from the kitchens of the quiet neighborhood. In one particular house on East 2nd Street, the Moore family had just returned from a long evening at church. They were tired, they were happy, and they were ready for a deep, peaceful sleep. But when a neighbor walked over to check on them a few hours later, she found the house completely silent, and every single window covered from the inside. When the door was finally forced open, the town was met with a sight that made no sense. Every person in the house had been killed in their beds. But the strangest part was not the violence. It was the mirrors. Every mirror and glass surface in the house had been meticulously covered with black cloth and old clothing. The mystery is not just who did it, but why a killer would take the time to hide the reflections of their victims before vanishing into the cornfields. Tonight, I am going to tell you the 4th story in our series of 10 about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. The air inside that house didn't just feel old. It felt heavy with the scent of cold, wet iron and the faint, sweet smell of a kerosene lamp that had burned itself out hours ago. In the absolute darkness of the hallway, there was a sound that was barely a sound at all. It was the dry, rhythmic rustling of a heavy piece of cloth being draped over a wooden frame. It was the sound of a person moving with incredible care, their bare feet pressing into the floorboards without making a single creak. The atmosphere was thick, like walking through water, and the only light came from the thin cracks in the window shades, casting long, skeletal fingers across the walls. Josiah Moore was 43 years old and was arguably one of the most successful businessmen in Villisca. He was a man of high standing, a hard worker who ran a prosperous farm implement company. Everyone in town knew Josiah, and everyone liked him. He was a pillar of the Presbyterian Church, a devoted husband to his wife Sarah, and a doting father to their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were the picture of the American dream in the early 20th century. The Moores were anchored in the kind of normalcy that feels untouchable. Their house was filled with the sounds of piano practice, the smell of fresh laundry, and the constant chatter of children. On that particular Sunday, they even had 2 guests staying over, the Stillinger sisters, who were friends of the children. To anyone looking in, the Moore household was a sanctuary of safety and love. They were the last people on earth anyone expected to be visited by a monster in the night. The evening of June 9th had been a long, festive celebration at the church. It was Children's Day, and the Moore children had been practicing their recitations and songs for weeks. The program didn't finish until almost 9:30 in the evening. The family lingered at the church for a while, talking to friends and neighbors, enjoying the warm night air. There was a light rain falling, a gentle summer drizzle that made the wooden sidewalks slick and the air smell like wet dust. At around 9:45, Josiah gathered his family and the 2 Stillinger girls to begin the walk home. They walked slowly, the children splashing in the small puddles, and Josiah holding an umbrella over Sarah. It was a short walk, only a few blocks, and they passed several neighbors who waved from their porches. Everything about the walk was routine. The familiar rhythm of their footsteps on the wooden planks, the dim glow of the street lamps, and the quiet murmur of the town settling down. When they finally reached their house at 508 East 2nd Street, Josiah pulled out his heavy brass key and unlocked the front door. He ushered everyone inside, the children giggling as they shook the rain off their coats. Josiah went through his nightly ritual of checking the stove and making sure the back door was bolted. He took his time, moving from room to room with a lamp, ensuring his home was secure before he finally climbed the stairs to his own bed. Sarah spent nearly 20 minutes helping the younger children get into their pajamas and making sure the Stillinger girls were comfortable in the guest room on the first floor. She moved with a motherly precision, tucking in the sheets and kissing each forehead. The house was a symphony of small, mundane sounds. The creak of the bed springs, the soft thud of shoes being dropped on the rug, and the quiet whispers of the children as they finally drifted off into a deep, rain-induced sleep. By midnight, the house was completely dark. The only sound was the steady breathing of 8 people and the light patter of rain on the roof. Josiah lay in his bed next to Sarah, his eyes closed, his mind finally drifting away from the day's business. He felt completely at peace. He had no way of knowing that while he was checking the locks, someone was already inside. Someone was crouched in the crawl space of the attic, holding a heavy axe, listening to every sound he made. The subtle shift happened around 2 in the morning. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the sound of the attic door slowly, infinitesimally swinging open. A tiny sliver of air moved through the hallway, carrying with it a strange, metallic odor that didn't belong in a family home. A shadow, darker than the night itself, detached from the wall and began to move. It didn't head for the valuables or the kitchen. It moved toward the bedrooms with a terrifying, calculated silence. Now, I want you to imagine you are Josiah Moore. You are in that state between sleep and wakefulness when you hear a floorboard groan right outside your door. It is a sound you know well, but tonight, the timing is wrong. You think for a second it might be one of the children getting a glass of water, so you stay still, waiting for the sound of the faucet. But the faucet never turns on. Instead, you hear a heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from the foot of your bed. Your heart begins to hammer against your ribs, a dull, thudding sensation that you can feel in your ears. Your mouth is dry, and you try to call out Sarastain, but the words won't come. You reach out your hand in the dark, feeling for the matches on the nightstand, but your fingers brush against something cold and hard. It feels like iron. In that split second, you realize that the person in your room is not a child and they are not there to talk. Your choice is made for you. You are lying in your own bed right now, listening to this. Think about the shadows in the corner of your room. How well do you really know what is behind your closet door? If you heard that breathing right now, would you have the courage to reach out and touch the darkness? Because Josiah Moore never had the chance to fight back. The killer moved with a speed and a brutality that left no room for struggle. The darkness simply swallowed the Moore family whole. The bizarre reveal came when the neighbor, Ed Selly, finally entered the house later that morning. He didn't just find the bodies. He found a scene of ritualistic madness. Every single person had been struck with the blunt end of Josiah's own axe. But after the killing was done, the murderer had gone through the house and covered every mirror and every window with black cloth, even using the children's clothing to hide the reflections. A plate of uneaten food was left on the table. In the guest room where the Stillinger girls lay, the killer had placed a slab of bacon wrapped in a towel on the floor. It was a detail so strange and so specific that it baffled the investigators for decades. There were no fingerprints, no robbery, and no clear motive. The killer had even searched the house for a bowl of water to wash his hands before leaving. He had stayed in the house for hours after the crime, moving through the rooms of the dead with a calm, chilling focus. The Villisca axe murders became a national sensation, attracting thousands of onlookers and dozens of private detectives. Several suspects were brought to trial, including a traveling minister with a history of mental illness and a business rival of Josiah's, but no one was ever convicted. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. The house still stands in Villisca, and it has become a destination for those seeking to understand the darkness that visited East 2nd Street. The mystery of the covered mirrors has led to many theories, ranging from religious superstitions to the killer's own fear of seeing his reflection. But the truth is, we will likely never know what was going through the mind of the person who held that axe. The crime left a permanent scar on the town of Iowa, a reminder that the safety of a small town is an illusion that can be shattered by a single person with a dark purpose and a heavy tool in their hand. As we leave the quiet, haunted streets of Villisca, we move toward the industrial heart of America. We are traveling to Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s. While the Villisca killer targeted a single family in their home, our next monster chose a very different hunting ground. He moved through the slums and the shanty towns of a city crippled by the Great Depression, leaving behind a trail of victims that were not just killed, but were dismantled with surgical precision. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. In the 1930s, the city of Cleveland was a place of iron, smoke, and desperate people. The Great Depression had turned once thriving neighborhoods into shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, where thousands lived in shacks made of scrap metal and cardboard. It was a landscape of forgotten souls. But in the middle of this misery, a monster began to work. He didn't just kill people. He dismantled them with a level of surgical skill that was both terrifying and impossible to ignore. The mystery is not just that he was never caught, but that he chose to taunt the most famous lawman in America, Eliot Ness. The man who had taken down Al Capone in Chicago moved to Cleveland to clean up the city, but he found himself completely powerless against an invisible butcher who left headless torsos in the muddy ravines of Kingsbury Run. The killer wasn't a crazed animal. He was a master of human anatomy who treated his victims like a grotesque art project. Tonight, I am going to tell you the fifth story in our series of 10 about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. Now, let us get into our next case. The air in the Kingsbury Run area of Cleveland smelled like rotting garbage and heavy industrial grease. It was a thick, oily mist that clung to your clothes and made every breath feel heavy, as if the city itself was slowly suffocating under the weight of the depression. In the late afternoon of September 5th, 1935, the only sound in the ravine was the distant, rhythmic clanking of a freight train moving slowly over the rusted tracks. It was a dull, metallic heartbeat that echoed off the steep, soot-covered walls of the valley. Between the gusts of wind, you could hear the faint, wet sound of water dripping from a drainage pipe into a stagnant pool of black mud. It was a place where light seemed to die before it reached the ground. Edward Andrassy was 28 years old and had once been a man with a future. He was a graduate of a local high school and had spent some time working as an orderly at a city hospital. He was a handsome man with a sharp jawline and a quick wit, but the depression had stripped away his stability. By 1935, Edward was drifting through the fringes of society, spending his time in the bars and pool halls of the roaring 3rd District, looking for a way to survive. He was anchored in the normalcy of a man trying to find his footing in a world that had moved on without him. He still lived with his parents, and every morning he would sit at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee and reading the classified ads. His mother would iron his shirts, and his father would offer him advice he didn't want to hear. To his family, Edward was just a son going through a rough patch, a normal guy caught in a bad time, safe within the walls of their home. The daily routine for Edward during that final week in September was a grueling exercise in repetition. He would leave the house at 8 o'clock in the morning, his shoes hitting the pavement with a steady, hollow rhythm. He would walk the same 12 blocks to the city center, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He would visit the employment office, stand in a line for 3 hours, and then walk back out into the gray Cleveland air. It was a cycle of hope and rejection. Every afternoon, he followed the same path through the industrial heart of the city. He would walk along the edge of the Cuyahoga River, watching the heavy barges move through the oily water. He would stop at a small diner for a nickel cup of soup, blowing on the steam and watching the other men who were doing the exact same thing. He would count his remaining pennies, turning them over in his hand, feeling the cold copper against his palm as he planned his next move. He spent hours just sitting on a park bench, watching the pigeons and the streetcars. He noticed the small details of the city, the way the soot collected on the windowsills, the sound of the wind whistling through the telephone wires, and the smell of the coal smoke from the nearby factories. He was a man waiting for something to happen, moving through a landscape of iron and stone with a predictable, mundane pace that made him feel invisible to everyone around him. By the time the sun began to set on his final day, Edward had walked nearly 10 miles. He was tired, his feet were aching, and the chill of the evening was starting to seep through his thin coat. He decided to take a shortcut through Kingsbury Run, a path he had taken dozens of times before. He knew every rusted fence and every pile of discarded lumber. He moved with a sense of familiarity, his footsteps echoing softly in the darkening ravine as he headed toward the city lights. The subtle shift happened when Edward reached a clearing near a cluster of willow trees. It wasn't a sudden attack, it was a smell. It wasn't the usual scent of the river or the trash. It was a sweet, cloying aroma that reminded him of the disinfectant he used to use at the hospital, but mixed with something metallic and raw. He paused, his heart skipping a beat. The wind died down, and the silence that followed was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own blood rushing. He looked toward the tall grass near the tracks and saw something that didn't belong. It was a pale, smooth shape that caught the last bit of light from the horizon. It looked like a discarded mannequin from a department store, but it was positioned too deliberately. As he took a step closer, he realized that the shape was actually two bodies. They were positioned side by side, perfectly clean, as if they had been scrubbed. But as he looked up toward where their heads should be, there was nothing. Now, I want you to imagine you are a scavenger moving through that ravine. You are looking for a piece of copper or a discarded tool you can sell for a meal. You see those shapes in the grass, and your first thought is that you found something valuable. You reach out your hand to touch the smooth, cold skin, thinking it is stone or plastic. But then you feel the weight of it. You feel the reality of what you are looking at. your throat constricts, and your legs turn to water. You are standing in a city where thousands of people are missing, where no one keeps track of the drifters and the homeless. You realize that the person who did this is still here, somewhere in the shadows of the bridges and the factories. They didn't just kill these men. They took their time. They worked with a surgical precision that required light, tools, and a total lack of fear. Do you run to the police, or do you keep walking, knowing that in this city, being noticed is a death sentence? Because here is the thing. The killer wasn't just hiding. He was watching the investigation. When Elliot Ness took over the case, the killer began to leave bodies in places where they would be found immediately, sometimes right across from Ness's office window. The bizarre reveal came during the autopsies. The medical examiner discovered that the victims had been decapitated while they were still alive. The cuts were so clean that they could only have been made by someone with expert knowledge. This wasn't the work of a madman with a jagged knife. This was someone who knew exactly where the joints were, someone who could navigate the human body with the grace of a sculptor. The killer had used a massive amount of water to clean the bodies and the scene, a detail that suggested he had access to a private space with plumbing, something very few people in the shantytowns had. He was a monster who lived among the elite, hunting the people that society had already forgotten. Elliot Ness grew so frustrated with his inability to catch the butcher that he eventually ordered the police to burn down the entire Hooverville shantytown in Kingsbury Run. He rounded up hundreds of people and destroyed their only shelter, hoping to flush out the killer, but the killing simply stopped. The butcher vanished as if he had never existed, leaving behind 12 confirmed victims and a legacy of terror that broke the spirit of the man who had once been considered untouchable. The mystery of the Cleveland torso murderer remains one of the darkest chapters in American history. It is a story of a city that failed its most vulnerable people and a monster who exploited that failure with a terrifying, calculated cruelty. The ravine is still there, now covered in concrete and hidden by modern buildings, but the memory of the butcher still lingers in the cold Cleveland air. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who have the skills to heal as well as to destroy. As we leave the industrial shadows of Ohio, we cross the dark waters of the Atlantic once again. We are heading to the rugged coastline of Norway, to a place known as the Valley of Death. It is the year 1970. While the Butcher of Cleveland left behind bodies without names, our next story is about a woman who had too many names. She was a ghost with a suitcase full of disguises, and her end in the frozen mountains would spark a global mystery that still haunts the world of espionage. Story 6. The Ayesdal Woman. The wind in the mountains surrounding Bergen, Norway, does not just blow, it bites. In late November, the air is so sharp it feels like 1,000 tiny needles pressing against your exposed skin. The sky stays a heavy, bruised shade of gray for weeks on end, and the mist rolls off the North Sea, crawling up the jagged rock faces until it swallows the valleys whole. It is a beautiful, desolate landscape where the silence is so heavy it rings in your ears. But on the afternoon of November 29th, 1970, that silence was broken by a smell that didn't belong in the fresh, alpine air. It was thick, oily, and cloying. It smelled like burning rubber mixed with something sickly sweet and organic. It was a scent that clung to the back of your throat, making you want to gag before you even knew what you were looking at. In a place known to locals as Death Valley, something was smoldering in the shadows. A man and his 2 young daughters were out for a Sunday hike, trying to make the most of the dwindling daylight. They were anchored in the normalcy of a typical Norwegian weekend. The father was a local teacher, a man who loved the outdoors and wanted to share the rugged beauty of his home with his children. They were wearing thick wool sweaters and sturdy leather boots, their faces flushed pink from the exertion of climbing the steep, scree-covered slopes. To the girls, this was an adventure. They were looking for interesting rocks and watching for the occasional mountain goat. They were safe, surrounded by the familiar peaks they saw from their bedroom windows every morning. They had no reason to suspect that their hike was about to lead them directly into the center of a global mystery. They were just a family, enjoying the quiet companionship of the trail, moving through the wilderness with a predictable, happy pace. The woman at the center of this mystery followed a routine that was as precise as a Swiss watch. For months leading up to that day, she had traveled across Europe, moving between cities like Oslo, Geneva, Paris, and Hamburg. Every time she arrived in a new city, she followed the exact same sequence of events. She would walk into a high-end hotel, her back straight and her chin held high, carrying several heavy, expensive-looking suitcases made of dark leather. She would approach the check-in desk and smile politely at the clerk. She always spoke in broken English or accented French, giving a different name every single time. One day she was Genevieve Prezot from Belgium. The next she was Claudia Tielt from Germany. She would fill out the registration forms with a steady, practiced hand, providing passport numbers and home addresses that seemed perfectly legitimate at first glance. She never looked nervous or rushed. Once she was in her room, the routine continued. She would spend hours inside, rarely calling for room service. When she did go out, she would change her appearance entirely. She would walk out of the hotel wearing a dark wig and a heavy trench coat, only to return hours later in a different outfit with her natural hair showing. She was a woman who lived her life in the transitions, moving through the lobbies and train stations like a ghost that no one quite noticed. She was seen at the Hotel Neptune in Bergen just a few days before her death. The staff remembered her because she was striking, but also because she was strange. She would sit in the dining room and order a bowl of porridge every single morning. She would eat it slowly, her eyes fixed on the entrance, watching every person who walked through the door. She would rearrange the furniture in her room, moving the desk so it faced the door, as if she was waiting for a visitor. The subtle shift happened when the hiking family reached a small plateau in the valley. The father noticed that the rocks around a small stream were scorched black. It wasn't the remains of a campfire. It was a concentrated area of intense heat. As he stepped closer, he saw a woman's body wedged between two large boulders. She was lying on her back, her arms pulled up toward her chest in a defensive posture. Her clothes had been almost entirely consumed by the flames. But as the father looked closer, he realized something that made his blood turn to ice. There were items scattered around the body, positioned almost like a ritual. A pair of rubber boots, a silk scarf, and several plastic bottles that smelled of gasoline. But the strangest detail was the labels. Every single label on her clothing, from her coat to her underwear, had been meticulously cut away. Even the branding on the plastic bottles had been scraped off with a knife. Now I want you to imagine you are a police investigator arriving at that scene. You have seen bodies before, but this is different. You find a pair of suitcases in a locker at the Bergen train station that belonged to her. You open them, expecting to find a name, a letter, a photo, but instead, you find 8 fake passports. You find a collection of wigs and non-prescription glasses. You find several different currencies and a cryptic diary filled with numerical codes. You realize that this woman didn't just stumble into this valley and die. She was erased. Someone, or perhaps the woman herself, had spent hours ensuring that not a single thread of her life could be traced back to a real person. You are standing in the middle of the Cold War, and you start to wonder if the woman in the valley was a soldier in a war that has no front lines. You feel the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing down on you in that small room. You are faced with a choice that haunts every detective who has ever worked this case. Do you treat this as a tragic suicide of a mentally ill woman who wanted to disappear? Or do you follow the trail of the codes and the passports into the dark world of international espionage? Because here's the thing. The autopsy revealed that the woman had swallowed over 70 sleeping pills before she was set on fire. She was alive when the match was struck. The bizarre reveal came when the police finally managed to crack some of the codes in her diary. They weren't poems or random numbers, they were dates and locations. They tracked her movements across Europe and found that she had been present at several secret military test sites in Norway where the new Penguin missiles were being developed. She wasn't just a traveler. She was an observer. But who was she observing for? Was she a spy for the East or a double agent for the West? Despite the involvement of Interpol and intelligence agencies from across the globe, the Isdal woman was never identified. Her fingerprints didn't match any records. Her dental work was unique, suggesting she had visited expensive clinics in South America or Eastern Europe, but no dentist ever came forward. She was buried in a nameless grave in Bergen in 1971, in a zinc coffin that would not decompose, just in case someone ever came to claim her. No one ever did. The case was officially closed as a suicide, but the people of Norway never believed it. In recent years, modern ADN testing has shown that she was likely born in the border region between France and Germany around 1930. She had lived through the horrors of the Second World War and had somehow emerged as a woman of 1,000 faces. She was a professional at being nobody, and in the end, she succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. The mystery of the Isdal woman is a reminder that there are people moving among us who exist only in the shadows. They occupy the hotel rooms next to ours and sit across from us on trains, carrying suitcases full of secrets and lives that are written in code. When they vanish, they leave behind a void that no amount of investigation can fill. They are the ghosts of our modern world, and sometimes they choose a lonely valley in Norway to make their final exit. As we leave the frozen silence of Bergen, we travel across the ocean to the city of Philadelphia in 1957. While the Isdal woman was a person who chose to hide her identity behind a wall of fake passports, our next story is about someone who never had the chance to even know who they were. Because as we will see, the mystery of a body in a box can be just as haunting as a spy in a mountain valley, especially when the victim is just a child. Story 7. The Boy in the Box. The air in the Fox Chase section of Philadelphia in late February of 1957 was the kind of cold that feels heavy and wet. It was the type of damp chill that doesn't just sit on your skin, but actually feels like it is pressing into your joints and slowing down your movements. There was a constant, low-hanging mist that clung to the leafless branches of the oak trees, and the ground was a messy carpet of half-frozen mud and decaying brown leaves that smelled like wet earth and old paper. In a small patch of woods just off Susquehanna Road, the silence was absolute. There were no birds singing and no wind to rustle the brush. The only thing you could hear was the distant, rhythmic hum of the city miles away and the occasional drop of condensation falling from a branch onto a soggy piece of cardboard. The woods felt like they were holding a secret, something small and fragile that had been tucked away in a place where the world was never supposed to look for it. Frederick Benasis was a 20-year-old college student who was just trying to finish his degree and maybe make a little extra money on the side. He was a quiet, unassuming young man who appreciated the simple things in life. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he wasn't interested in the headlines of the day. He was a man who found comfort in the predictable nature of his studies and the quiet, solitary hobby he had picked up to help pay for his books and his small apartment. To his classmates and his family, Frederick was the definition of normal. He was the kind of person who showed up on time, did his work without complaining, and kept his shoes polished. He lived in a world where the rules were clear and the future was something you built with hard work and patience. He felt safe in his routine, anchored by the belief that if you just kept your head down and did what was expected of you, nothing truly strange or dark would ever cross your path. Every afternoon after his classes finished, Frederick would drive his old car out to the edge of the city. He had a series of muskrat traps set up in the marshy areas near the woods, and checking them was a task he performed with military precision. He would pull his car onto the shoulder of the road at exactly 4 o'clock, the engine ticking as it cooled in the winter air. He would step out and stretch, feeling the sharp bite of the wind against his neck. He would pull on a pair of heavy rubber boots, the kind that reached up to his knees and made a dull, thudding sound as he walked. He would grab a small canvas bag and head into the brush. He followed the same narrow trail every single day, his eyes fixed on the ground, looking for the specific markers he had placed near the water's edge. He knew every fallen log and every patch of briars. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace that was born of a year of repetition. He would kneel down in the mud, his knees making a soft, squelching sound, and reach into the icy water to check the tension of the wires. He would reset the traps that had been tripped by the current, his fingers going numb from the cold. He would take his time, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. The routine was a form of meditation for him, a way to clear his head of the complex equations and historical dates that filled his mind during the long hours at the university. After the traps were checked, he would walk back through the woods toward his car. He always took the same path, a slightly elevated ridge that gave him a clear view of the surrounding trees. He would count his steps, a habit he had since he was a child, hitting the same milestones at the same time every single day. 100 steps to the big rock, 200 steps to the split maple tree, 300 steps to the clearing. It was a mundane, perfect stretch of time. He would stop at the edge of the clearing and scan the area for any signs of movement. He liked to see the deer moving through the trees, their shadows long and thin in the fading light. He would breathe in the cold air, feeling the sting in his lungs, and think about what he was going to have for dinner. He was a man completely at peace with his surroundings, a person who believed that the woods were just a quiet backdrop to his very ordinary and very safe life. The subtle shift happened on February 25th. Frederick was about 50 yards from his car when he spotted something that didn't belong in the brush. It was a large cardboard box, the kind used for shipping furniture. It was sitting upright in a patch of weeds, its flaps folded over neatly. It was a J.C. Penney bassinet box, the kind of thing a young family would buy for a new baby. Frederick stopped, his heart giving a small, sharp tug against his ribs. It was out of place, but it wasn't alarming. He figured someone had just used the quiet road as a place to dump their trash. He stared at the box for a minute, wondering if he should move it or just leave it for the city crews to find. But as he looked at it, he noticed that the cardboard wasn't as soggy as it should have been, considering the rain they had the night before. It looked like it had been placed there recently, with a level of care that didn't fit with illegal dumping. He took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the frozen grass. He felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread, the kind of instinctual warning that usually tells you to run. The silence of the woods, which had always felt peaceful, now felt suffocating. He noticed that the box wasn't empty. There was a weight to it, a presence that seemed to push against the air around it. He reached out a gloved hand toward the flap, his fingers trembling just a little bit. Now, I want you to put yourself in Frederick's position. You are 20 years old, you are alone in the woods, you have no reason to expect anything but garbage inside that box. You tell yourself it is probably just a discarded doll or maybe some old blankets. You take a deep breath, trying to steady your nerves, and you pull back the top flap of the cardboard. Your heart isn't just beating fast, it is pounding against your chest like a hammer hitting an anvil. Your eyes struggle to adjust to the dim light inside the box. You see something pale, you see a small, delicate hand, and then you realize that you aren't looking at a doll, you are looking at a child. A small boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, lying on his side with his eyes closed. He looks like he is sleeping, but the skin is too white, too still. Your throat tightens until you can't swallow. You want to scream, but your voice is trapped in your chest. You are faced with a choice that will change the rest of your life. Do you run back to your car and pretend you never saw anything, fearing that the police will blame you for being in the woods with illegal traps? Or do you do the right thing and call for help, knowing that once you do, your ordinary life is over? Because here is the thing. Frederick didn't call the police right away. He was terrified. He went home and tried to forget, but the image of that small boy stayed with him. It took another day before a different man, a student named John Stakowiak, found the box and reported it. When the police arrived, they found a scene that would haunt the city of Philadelphia for generations. The boy was clean. His fingernails had been recently trimmed, his hair had been cut short, almost into a buzz cut, and small clumps of hair were still clinging to his body. He was wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket, but he was severely malnourished and covered in small scars. The bizarre reveal didn't happen in a day. It took 65 years. For decades, the boy was known only as the boy in the box. Thousands of leads were followed, thousands of people were interviewed, his image was placed on posters across the country. He was buried in a grave that read, "America's Unknown Child." But in December of 2022, thanks to the miracle of modern genetic genealogy, the boy finally got his name back. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The investigation revealed that Joseph was born in 1953, but his life had been one of unimaginable suffering. While his name was finally known, the person who put him in that box remains a mystery. The case is still open, and the police are still searching for the person who took a small, innocent life and tried to erase it in a patch of woods in Philadelphia. Joseph is no longer unknown, but the justice he deserves is still waiting in the shadows. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is a reminder that even when a crime is hidden for a lifetime, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. It tells us that no one is truly forgotten, and that the world will eventually find a way to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. The woods where he was found are gone now, replaced by houses and roads, but the memory of the boy in the box still lingers, a silent witness to the darkness that can hide in plain sight. As we leave the cold streets of Philadelphia, we travel back in time to the year 1884. We are heading to Austin, Texas, a place of heat, dust, and frontier justice. While Joseph was a victim of a silent, hidden cruelty, our next story is about a predator who was loud and violent. He was a shadow that moved through the servant quarters of the city. leaving behind a trail of terror that some believe was the true beginning of the age of the serial killer. Story 8. The Servant Girl Annihilator. The heat in Austin, Texas during the late 1800s did not just sit in the air. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on your shoulders. A thick, dusty blanket that smelled of dry cedar and horse manure. Even at night, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the limestone buildings would radiate that stored warmth back into the streets. The only reprieve was the occasional breeze that rattled the dry leaves of the oak trees, sounding like 100 small whispers in the dark. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 1884, the only sound in the servant quarters behind the grand houses was the rhythmic, high-pitched chirping of the crickets. It was a constant vibrating wall of noise that most people stopped hearing after a while. But on this particular night, the crickets suddenly went silent in a small yard near West Peck Street. The air became still, and the only thing left was the sound of a heavy iron bolt being slid back with a slow, agonizingly quiet scrape. Molly Smith was 25 years old and was known throughout the neighborhood as one of the most reliable domestic workers in the city. She worked for a wealthy merchant named Walter Hall, and she took great pride in her ability to keep a household running like a Swiss watch. Molly was a tall, strong woman with a steady gaze and a quiet dignity. She didn't have much in the way of material wealth, but she had her reputation and she had the respect of everyone who knew her for her incredible work ethic. She was anchored in the normalcy of a life built on service and survival. Every morning, before the rest of the city had even opened their eyes, Molly was already in the kitchen, stoking the embers of the wood stove. She lived in a small, one-room cabin just behind the main house, a space that was her own tiny sanctuary in a world that often ignored people like her. She felt safe in the shadow of the big house, protected by the routine and the familiar walls of the community she served every day. The routine for Molly Smith was a grueling, repetitive cycle that required every ounce of her strength. It began with the water. Every single morning, she would walk to the iron pump in the yard, her boots crunching on the dry soil. She would grip the heavy handle, her palms calloused and rough, and begin the rhythmic motion of pumping. The first few strokes were always dry and hollow, but then the water would surge forward, a cold, clear stream that splashed into her wooden buckets with a heavy metallic ringing. She would carry those buckets, each weighing nearly 40 pounds, back to the kitchen. She did this 4 times before the sun was even up. Then came the scrubbing. Molly would spend hours on her knees, her apron soaked with gray water, as she moved a heavy brush across the pine floorboards. She followed the grain of the wood, back and forth, until her joints ached and her vision blurred. She knew every knot in the wood, every slight imperfection in the floor that only someone who lived on their knees would ever notice. After the floors were done, she moved to the laundry. This was the most demanding task of all. She would stand over a massive copper tub filled with boiling water, the steam rising up and sticking to her skin. She would use a heavy wooden paddle to stir the heavy sheets and shirts, the fabric becoming a leaden weight as it soaked up the water. She would scrub the stains by hand using a bar of harsh lye soap that made her fingers red and raw. She never rushed. She never skipped a step. She would wring out the heavy fabric, her muscles straining against the resistance, and then carry the wet laundry out to the lines in the yard. She would pin each item with a wooden peg, making sure they were spaced exactly 4 inches apart so they would dry evenly in the Texas sun. She would watch the white sheets snap in the wind, looking like ghosts dancing against the blue sky. It was a mundane, exhausting stretch of time that occupied nearly 10 hours of her day every single day of the week. By the time the evening meal was finished and the dishes were dried and put away, Molly would walk back to her small cabin. She would light a single kerosene lamp, the flame dancing behind the glass chimney. She would sit on the edge of her bed, her feet throbbing, and slowly unlace her boots. She would listen to the sounds of the neighborhood settling down, a distant piano playing, the rattle of a passing carriage, and the low murmur of the Hall family in the big house. It was her time to be just Molly, not the servant, not the worker. The subtle shift happened on that final night in December. Molly had gone to bed around 10 o'clock, but she couldn't seem to fall into her usual deep sleep. The air felt charged, as if a storm was brewing, but the sky was perfectly clear. She noticed that the Hall's dog, a large retriever that usually barked at any shadow, was deathly quiet. She lay there in the dark, her eyes fixed on the small window. She saw a flicker of movement, a tall shadow that didn't match the shape of the trees or the fence. It wasn't a sudden crash or a loud noise. It was the feeling of the floorboards shifting. Her cabin was built on stone piers, and she felt a slight vibration as if someone very heavy had stepped onto the porch. She sat up, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She reached for the small knife she kept under her pillow for protection, her fingers trembling as they closed around the handle. She didn't call out. She didn't want to wake the Hall family if it was just a stray animal or a neighbor taking a shortcut. Now, I want you to put yourself in Molly's position. You are 25 years old, you are alone in a small wooden room, and you know for a fact that someone is standing right outside your door. You hear the slow, deliberate breathing of a person who is not afraid of being caught. You have a choice to make in that split second. Do you scream as loud as you can, hoping someone in the big house hears you? Or do you stay silent, hoping they think the cabin is empty and move on to the next target? You are lying in your own bed right now, and you know exactly where the weak points in your house are. You know which door doesn't lock quite right and which window has a loose latch. Now, imagine that lock is being turned from the outside by a hand that doesn't belong there. Your throat is so dry you can't even swallow. You feel the cold air from the porch rush into the room as the door slowly swings open. You see the silhouette of a man holding a long, heavy tool. It is not a knife. It is an axe. You realize that this person didn't come here to steal your meager belongings. They came here for you. They have been watching your routine, counting your buckets of water, and waiting for the moment when you were the most exhausted and the most vulnerable. You feel a wave of sheer, primal terror wash over you as the figure steps into the room. You have no way to escape. The choice was never yours to make. The predator has found its prey in the dark heart of the city of Austin. The bizarre reveal came when the police arrived at the scene the next morning. Molly Smith had been dragged from her bed and murdered with a brutality that shocked even the most hardened lawmen in Texas. But the killer had left a signature that made no sense. He had used a sharp object to pierce through Molly's ear, pinning her to the ground. It was a ritualistic, terrifying detail that suggested the killer wasn't just a murderer, but a person with a twisted, symbolic message to send to the rest of the world. Over the next year, 7 more people would be killed in the exact same way. The local newspapers called him the Servant Girl Annihilator. He attacked only during the darkest nights of the month, moving with a silent efficiency that led many to believe he was a ghost or a supernatural entity. He targeted domestic workers, both black and white, breaking the social barriers of the time through sheer, undiluted terror. He would leave the doors to the big houses wide open, as if inviting the owners to see what he had done to their staff. The most shocking part of the story is the theory that emerged years later. In December of 1885, the killings in Austin suddenly stopped. The Annihilator vanished as if he had never existed. But just a few years later, across the ocean in London, a new killer emerged, who used a remarkably similar set of skills and a similar pattern of ritualistic mutilation. Some researchers believe that the Servant Girl Annihilator was the rough draft for Jack the Ripper, a man who honed his craft in the heat of Texas before moving to the fog of London. The case of the Servant Girl Annihilator remains officially unsolved. No one was ever convicted, and the identity of the monster who haunted the streets of Austin stays buried in the dust of history. The city eventually moved on, building over the sites of the murders and forgetting the names of the women who died. But the fear he created changed the city forever, leading to the construction of the famous Moonlight Towers that still stand today, designed to light up the night so the shadows would have nowhere to hide. As we leave the hot, haunted nights of 19th century Texas, we move forward in time to the year 1945. We are heading to the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, on a night that was supposed to be a celebration. While the Annihilator used an axe to destroy lives, our next story is about a different kind of destruction. Because, as the Sauter family was about to find out, a fire can take away more than just a house. It can leave behind a mystery that lasts for a lifetime. Story 9. The Sauter Children. The smell of Christmas Eve in the Appalachian Mountains is usually a beautiful mix of fresh pine needles and the sweet, heavy scent of baking ham. In 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the air was crisp and bone-chilling, the kind of cold that makes the snow crunch like broken glass under your boots. But by 1 o'clock in the morning, that festive aroma was replaced by something sharp, acrid, and terrifying. It was the smell of burning rubber and melting insulation. The sound of the night was no longer the quiet rustle of the wind through the leafless trees. It was the roar of a hungry furnace, a high-pitched whistling sound as the wind whipped through the structure of a house that was being eaten from the inside out. The orange glow against the white snow was beautiful in a horrifying way, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like fingers reaching out for help. In that valley, the silence of the winter was shattered by the crackle of a family's life turning into ash. George Sauter was a 50-year-old man who had built a life for himself through sheer determination. He had emigrated from Italy as a teenager and worked his way up from a common laborer to the owner of a successful trucking company. He was a man of strong opinions and even stronger lungs, known for his booming voice and his unwavering love for his large family. He lived in a sturdy, 2-story timber frame house with his wife Jenny and 9 of their 10 children. One son was away in the military. To the people of Fayetteville, the Sauters were the picture of immigrant success. They were anchored in the normalcy of a hard-working American life. George was a respected businessman, and Jenny was the heart of the home, a woman who could stretch a single loaf of bread to feed a dozen people. Their house was a place of constant motion, filled with the sounds of Italian and English being spoken at the same time, the clatter of heavy boots on the porch, and the constant, bright laughter of children. The routine of Christmas Eve 1945 began like any other year in the Sauter household. It was a day of orchestrated chaos that Jenny managed with a calm, practiced hand. She spent the entire morning in the kitchen, her hands dusted with white flour as she prepared the traditional Italian dishes. The sound of the rolling pin hitting the wooden counter was the heartbeat of the house. She moved with a rhythmic grace, clearing the table, washing the flour from her arms, and then starting on the next batch of cookies. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the older boys were helping George with the heavy lifting, bringing in extra firewood and stacking it neatly by the back door. They followed a specific pattern, placing the largest logs at the bottom to ensure the heat would last through the freezing night. George checked the latch on the cellar door and made sure the coal furnace was humming steadily. It was a mundane ritual of winter survival, a series of small, repetitive acts that kept the world outside from creeping in. After the sun went down, the children gathered in the living room. The younger ones, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were buzzing with the kind of excitement that only comes once a year. They spent hours carefully hanging their stockings over the fireplace, making sure each one was perfectly straight. They helped their mother arrange the small nativity scene on the mantel, placing each figure with a level of reverence that made the room feel small and sacred. It was a stretch of time that felt eternal and safe. Jenny spent nearly an hour after the meal was finished, slowly wiping down the heavy mahogany dining table. She used a soft cloth and a bit of oil, rubbing in small circles until the wood reflected the glow of the Christmas tree lights. She organized the mismatched chairs, pushing each one in until it clicked against the table leg. She then moved to the kitchen, washing each glass and drying it with a fresh towel before placing it back on the shelf. She took pride in the order of her home. Before she went to bed, Jenny performed her final walkthrough. She checked the locks on the front door, feeling the cold metal of the bolts slide into place. She adjusted the curtains in the parlor and made sure the fire in the grate was down to a safe, low simmer. She saw the younger children huddled in the living room, begging to stay up just a little longer to play with their new toys. She agreed, reminding them to turn off the lights and close the gate to the stairs before they went to bed. The subtle shift happened just after midnight. Jenny was drifting off to sleep when the telephone in the hallway began to ring. It was a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the silence of the house. She climbed out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floorboards, and answered it. On the other end, a woman she didn't recognize was laughing with the sound of glasses clinking in the background. It was a wrong number, a small mistake, but it left Jenny with a strange feeling of unease that she couldn't explain. As she walked back to her room, she noticed that the lights in the living room were still on and the curtains were wide open. The children were nowhere to be seen. She assumed they had gone up to their attic bedroom and simply forgotten their chores. She turned off the lights and pulled the curtains shut, her hands lingering on the fabric for a second. As she finally closed her eyes, she heard a dull thud on the roof. It sounded like a heavy rubber ball hitting the shingles and rolling down to the gutter. Now, I want you to step into Jenny's shoes in that exact moment. You are exhausted from the holiday, and you are finally falling into a deep sleep when you smell something. It isn't the sweet smell of the ham anymore. It is a thick, oily smoke that catches in the back of your throat and makes your eyes sting. You sit up, and you realize the room is not dark. There is a flickering orange light dancing under the door of your bedroom. The air in the hallway is hot, so hot it feels like it is singeing your hair. Your heart isn't just racing, it is slamming against your ribs like a trapped bird. You run to the door and open it, and you are met with a wall of flame that has already consumed the office and the stairs. You scream for George, and together you manage to get the 2 oldest boys and the youngest baby out of the house. But the 5 middle children are still upstairs in the attic. You are standing in the snow, in your nightgown, watching the only home you have ever known turn into a funeral pyre. You are standing on your lawn right now, and you are watching your children scream from the upstairs window. You run for your heavy ladder, the one you keep leaning against the side of the house every single day of your life. But it is gone. Someone has moved it. You run to your 2 big trucks, thinking you can drive them next to the house and climb on the roof. You turn the key, and nothing happens. Both trucks, which worked perfectly an hour ago, have had their wiring cut. You are faced with a choice that is more of a torture than a decision. Do you run into the wall of fire, knowing you won't survive the first 3 steps? Or do you stand there and watch the roof collapse, knowing that your children are still under it? Because here is the thing. George Sauter tried everything. He tried to climb the wall with his bare hands. He tried to use the water barrel, but it was frozen solid. He was forced to stand in the cold West Virginia mud and watch his world end. The bizarre reveal came the next morning when the fire was finally out. The fire department, which consisted of volunteers who didn't arrive for 7 hours, did a quick search of the ruins. They found nothing. No bones, no skulls, no remains of any kind. They told the Sauters that the fire was so hot it had cremated the children instantly, but experts later argued that a house fire in 1945 could never reach the temperatures necessary to turn human bone into ash in less than 45 minutes. Over the next few months, strange details began to surface. A man was seen stealing the ladder from the yard during the fire. A stranger had come by weeks earlier, warning George that his house would go up in smoke because of his criticisms of Mussolini. The telephone line hadn't been burned through, it had been cleanly cut at the top of the pole. George and Jenny became convinced that their children hadn't died in the fire. They believed they had been kidnapped by the Sicilian mafia, and the fire was a cover. The search for the Sauter children lasted for the rest of George and Jenny's lives. They put up a massive billboard on the highway near their home, featuring the faces of the 5 missing children and offering a huge reward. They received thousands of tips, including sightings of the children in cars with out-of-state plates. 20 years after the fire, Jenny received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo of a young man who looked exactly like their missing son, Louis. On the back of the photo, a cryptic message was written: Louis Sauter. I love Brother Frankie. Lil boys. The Sauters hired private investigators to track down the sender, but the trail went cold in Kentucky. George died in 1969, and Jenny wore black for the rest of her life, tending the garden she had planted over the site of the fire. The billboard stayed up until she passed away in 1989, a silent, heartbreaking reminder of a night that never truly ended for the Sauter family. The mystery of the Sauter children is a reminder that some wounds never heal, and some questions never get an answer. It shows us how a single night of terror can ripple through decades, turning a happy family into a group of ghosts searching for a truth that is buried under layers of ash and secrets. The billboard is gone now, but the empty space where the house once stood remains a monument to the missing. And as we leave the mountains of West Virginia, we travel to the rugged forests of Northern California. We are heading to a place called Ketty, to a small cabin in the woods known as Number 28. It is the year 1981, and another family is about to experience a night of violence that is as inexplicable as it is brutal. While the Sauter children vanished into the smoke, the victims in our final story were left behind in a scene of absolute carnage. It is a case where the survivors were just a few feet away, sleeping through a nightmare that would change the history of the region forever. The Ketty Cabin Murders. The sound of the forest in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the middle of April is supposed to be peaceful. It is a soft, rhythmic whispering of the wind through the giant sugar pines and the distant, low rushing of Spanish Creek as it carves its way through the canyon. But on the night of April 11th, 1981, the air inside cabin number 28 in the small resort town of Ketty felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. The only thing you could hear in the heavy darkness was a very specific, sharp sound. Shh, shh, shh. It was the sound of heavy-duty medical adhesive tape being pulled off a roll and torn by hand. It was a dry, plastic sound that echoed off the thin plywood walls of the cabin. It was followed by the dull, metallic thud of a hammer hitting something soft. The smell in the room was no longer the scent of pine needles, it was the thick, iron scent of fresh blood. Glenna Sue Sharp, who everyone just called Sue, was 36 years old and was the kind of woman who lived for her children. She was a single mother of 5 who had moved her family from Connecticut to the rugged mountains of Northern California looking for a fresh start. She didn't have much money and she was struggling to make ends meet, but she had a spirit that couldn't be broken. She was a kind, protective, and deeply resilient woman who worked every day. She was anchored in the normalcy of a mother trying to build a safe harbor for her kids in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and making sure her children stayed in school. To the other residents of the Ketty Resort, Sue was a quiet neighbor who kept her cabin tidy and her family close. She was exactly where she wanted to be, tucked away in a small mountain community where everyone knew everyone else's name. The routine of a Friday night in Cabin 28 followed a predictable, mundane pattern that was born from years of repetition. It began at around 5 o'clock in the evening when Sue started preparing a simple dinner of macaroni and cheese for the younger boys. She used a heavy wooden spoon to stir the pot, the plastic handle hitting the side of the metal with a rhythmic clack. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, wiping the steam from her glasses. She spent nearly 30 minutes organizing the small kitchen, placing each mismatched plate in its specific spot on the shelf. She wiped down the Formica table until it reflected the dim light of the overhead bulb. She then moved to the living room to fold a giant mountain of laundry. She folded each shirt into a perfect rectangle, smoothing out the wrinkles with her palms. She followed the same order every time: towels first, then jeans, then the children's socks. After the laundry was done, Sue sat on the worn sofa to watch a bit of television. The sound of the local news anchor's voice was a background hum that filled the small room. She checked the time on the wall clock, a cheap plastic one that ticked loudly in the silence. It was 7:30. Her oldest daughter, Sheila, was getting ready to walk across the road to a neighbor's cabin for a sleepover. Sue watched her pack a small bag, making sure she had a toothbrush. She watched Sheila walk out the door, the screen door clicking shut with a familiar, metallic rattle. Then, her 15-year-old son John and his friend Dana Wingate returned from the nearby town of Quincy. They had been hitchhiking and were full of stories about their day. Sue listened to them talk, her hands resting on her lap as they moved through the kitchen to grab a snack. She told them to keep the noise down because the younger boys were already asleep. John and Dana eventually settled down on the floor of the living room with their sleeping bags. Sue performed her final nightly ritual of checking the heaters and making sure the back door was bolted. She took her time, moving from room to room with a flashlight, ensuring her home was secure before she finally retreated to her own bedroom at the end of the hallway. The cabin was a symphony of small, everyday sounds, the hum of the fridge and the creak of the floor. By 10 o'clock, the cabin was completely dark. The only sound was the steady breathing of 5 people. Sue lay in her bed, her eyes closed, her mind finally drifting away from the worries of the upcoming rent payment. She felt completely at peace in the mountain silence. She had no way of knowing that while she was checking the locks, someone was watching the cabin from the shadows of the trees. Someone who knew exactly how thin the walls were and how far away the neighbors stayed. The subtle shift happened around midnight. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the sound of the front door being opened. The cabin was old, and the wood had warped over the years, meaning the door didn't always latch correctly unless you gave it a firm tug. A tiny sliver of cold mountain air moved through the living room, carrying with it the scent of wet earth. A shadow, darker than the night itself, stepped onto the carpet. It didn't head for the kitchen. It moved toward the sleeping bags where John and Dana were lying. The wind outside picked up, making the pine branches scrape against the roof like fingernails on glass. The silence of the cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Sue woke up for a second, thinking she heard a muffled thud in the next room, but she told herself it was just the boys moving in their sleep. She closed her eyes again, missing the moment when the world changed forever. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of 12-year-old Justin Eason. You are a friend of the family, and you are sleeping in the back bedroom with Sue's 2 youngest sons, Rick and Greg. You are in that state between a dream and reality when you hear a noise that doesn't belong in a house. It is the sound of a struggle. You hear heavy breathing and the sound of someone being dragged across the floor. You stay perfectly still, your heart hammering in your ears. Your room is pitch black, and the air feels freezing. You want to get up and check on your friends, but your legs are paralyzed by a primal fear you can't explain. You hear a voice, a low, gravelly whisper that sounds like it is coming from the hallway. You hear the sound of the tape. You realize that someone is in the living room and they are not there to talk. Your throat is so tight you can't even swallow, and you pull the blanket over your head. You are lying in your own bed right now, listening to this. Think about the room next to yours. If you heard a strange noise right now, would you have the courage to open the door? Or would you stay under the covers, hoping that the darkness would protect you? Because Justin stayed in that room all night. He claimed later that he saw two men in the living room through the crack in the door, but he was so terrified that he convinced himself it was just a nightmare. The bizarre reveal came the next morning at around 8 o'clock. Sheila Sharp walked back across the road to her own cabin, expecting to find her family eating breakfast. Instead, she found the front door standing wide open. When she stepped inside, she was met with a scene of absolute carnage. Her mother, her brother John, and his friend Dana were lying on the floor. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical cords, and they had been beaten with hammers. The brutality was beyond anything the local police had ever seen. But as the investigators arrived and began to process the scene, they realized something even more disturbing. In the back bedroom, just a few feet away from the murders, the three younger boys and Justin were still alive and completely unharmed. They had slept through the entire event, or at least they claimed to. But the biggest shock came when Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was nowhere to be found. Tina Sharp had been taken from her bed while the rest of the violence was happening. The search for the young girl lasted for 3 years, involving hundreds of volunteers and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In 1984, a hunter found a fragment of a human skull in the woods near Feather Falls, nearly 30 miles away from the Ketty Resort. It was Tina. She had been murdered on the same night as her mother and brother, her body dumped in the wilderness. The investigation into the Ketty cabin murders was a disaster from the start. Crucial evidence was lost, and the two primary suspects, who were neighbors of the family, were never charged, despite a mountain of circumstantial evidence. One of the suspects even made a recorded phone call to a therapist where he seemed to confess to the crime, but the recording was ignored by the local sheriff's department for decades. The motive for the attack remains a mystery to this day. The mystery of Cabin 28 has led to dozens of books and documentaries, and the cabin itself was eventually demolished in 2004 because no one could stand to live near it. The case remains officially unsolved, a dark stain on the history of the California mountains. It is a story of a family that was destroyed in the one place they felt the safest, by a monster who walked through an unlocked door and vanished into the trees without leaving a trace. The silence that hangs over the site of Cabin 28 today is a different kind of silence than the one from 1981. It is a silence of regret and of justice that was never served. It serves as a reminder that the world is a place where the strange and the dark can manifest in the middle of a mundane Friday night. The Sharp family's story is the final chapter in our journey through the 10 most horrific crimes that the world has tried to forget. As we conclude this series of 10 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, I want to thank you for listening. These stories are a reminder that the safety of our daily routines is a fragile thing, and the people we share our lives with are the only true anchors we have in a world full of shadows. Take a second tonight to check your locks, to hug your family, and to appreciate the peace of a quiet night in your own home.